Captain Mitchell's hands trembled as he read the termination letter. 3 decades of flying, countless perfect safety records, destroyed in one moment. The woman he'd humiliated in first class yesterday now sat across from him in the boardroom, her CEO nameplate gleaming. His career was over, but her real identity would change everything about commercial aviation forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more unbelievable real-life stories that will leave you speechless. Trust me, what happens next will completely shock you and change how you think about standing up for yourself. Now, let's go back 24 hours to see how this all began. The morning sun cast long shadows across Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport as Gabrielle Washington approached the Atlantic Airways gate. Her tailored Navy business suit spoke of success. Her confident stride suggested someone accustomed to first-class treatment. The leather briefcase in her hand contained documents that could reshape the airline industry, though she had no idea she was about to become the catalyst for that change herself. "Next," called Sarah Collins from behind the gate counter, her blonde hair pulled back in the regulation airline style. When Gabrielle approached with her boarding pass, Sarah's welcoming smile flickered for just a moment. "Ma'am, I'll need to see your identification." Gabrielle handed over her driver's license without hesitation. She'd grown accustomed to the extra scrutiny that came with being a successful black woman in corporate America. Sarah's eyes darted between the ID and the boarding pass multiple times, her brow furrowing as if solving a complex equation. "Is there a problem?" Gabrielle asked, politely, aware that other passengers were watching the interaction. "Just standard procedure," Sarah replied, though she'd waved through the 3 white passengers ahead of Gabrielle without requesting any identification. "Let me just verify this ticket in our system." The verification process stretched on for nearly 10 minutes. Sarah made 2 phone calls, consulted with a supervisor, and ran the ticket through the scanner 3 separate times. Behind Gabrielle, a line of increasingly impatient passengers began to form, their frustrated sighs creating an uncomfortable atmosphere. From the cockpit window of Flight 447, Captain Derek Mitchell observed the commotion at the gate. 28 years of flying had taught him to notice everything that might affect his flight. The tall black woman causing the delay looked expensive, professional, but something about the situation struck him as suspicious. In his experience, people who belonged in first class didn't cause problems at the gate. Finally cleared to board, Gabrielle made her way down the jet bridge, ignoring the stares and whispered comments from other passengers. She'd heard variations of the same assumptions countless times. How can she afford first class? Probably upgraded with miles. Must be flying on someone else's dime. Flight attendant Jessica Martinez greeted passengers at the aircraft door with practiced enthusiasm. Her smile remained bright for the elderly white couple ahead of Gabrielle, offering assistance with their carry-on bags and directing them to their seats with genuine warmth. When Gabrielle approached, Jessica's demeanor shifted subtly. "Boarding pass?" Jessica asked curtly, though she hadn't requested documentation from previous passengers. Gabrielle presented her ticket once again, Seat 2A clearly printed on the premium stock paper. Jessica examined it with the same suspicious scrutiny Sarah had displayed at the gate. "Right this way," Jessica said finally, her tone notably cooler than the cheerful welcome she'd extended to others. As Gabrielle settled into her window seat in the first-class cabin, she noticed the immediate change in atmosphere. The businessman. Across the aisle, Robert Sterling lowered his Wall Street Journal to study her with unconcealed curiosity. In the seat behind him, socialite Margaret Ashford whispered something to her traveling companion, while glancing repeatedly in Gabrielle's direction. Gabrielle opened her briefcase and retrieved a portfolio of documents, her movements precise and professional. The quarterly reports and strategic planning materials inside would have revealed her true identity to anyone who looked closely. But she'd learned long ago that people saw what they expected to see. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call. "Gabrielle Washington," she answered in a voice that commanded respect. "Ms. Washington, the board meeting agenda has been finalized for tomorrow morning," her assistant Marcus Williams said from the other end. "The Atlanta headquarters is ready for your presentation." "Excellent. I should be back in time for the 9 a.m. start. Any issues with the quarterly projections? Nothing major. The diversity initiative numbers are particularly impressive. The board will be pleased. As Gabrielle ended the call, she noticed Jessica Martinez hovering nearby, clearly eavesdropping. The flight attendant's expression suggested she found Gabrielle's professional conversation somehow inappropriate or unbelievable. Robert Sterling folded his newspaper completely now, his attention fully focused on Gabrielle. "Excuse me," he said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "But are you sure you're in the right section? Economy class is toward the back." The cabin fell silent. Other passengers turned to watch, their phones already emerging from pockets and purses. Gabrielle met Sterling's gaze with calm composure. "I'm quite certain I'm in the correct seat. Thank you." Margaret Ashford leaned forward, her voice carrying false concern. "Oh, honey, these things happen all the time. The airline computers make mistakes. I'm sure if you check with the flight attendant, they'll sort you out." Gabrielle smiled politely but firmly. "My ticket clearly shows seat 2A. There's no mistake." The tension in the cabin was palpable now. Jessica Martinez approached, flanked by another flight attendant, David Thompson. Both wore expressions of forced politeness, masking obvious discomfort. "Ma'am," Jessica began, "we've received some concerns about seating arrangements. Would you mind if we double-checked your ticket?" For the third time in 30 minutes, Gabrielle presented her boarding pass. Jessica and David examined it together, their heads bent in whispered consultation that lasted far longer than necessary for reading a simple seat assignment. From his position in the cockpit, Captain Mitchell watched the scene unfold through the cabin camera system. The situation was escalating, and in his professional opinion, it was time to intervene. He'd seen troublemakers before, passengers who tried to sneak into premium cabins where they didn't belong. This woman, despite her expensive clothes and confident demeanor, was clearly causing disruption. Mitchell made his decision. He would handle this personally, quickly, and efficiently before the situation delayed his departure. After all, he had a schedule to maintain and a reputation for running tight operations. The woman would have to move, and if she refused, airport security could escort her off the plane entirely. As he stood to leave the cockpit, Mitchell had no idea that his next actions would end his career and transform the entire airline industry. The woman in seat 2A wasn't just another passenger trying to get something for nothing. She was about to become the most powerful person in his professional life, and his assumptions were about to cost him everything. Captain Mitchell emerged from the cockpit with the confident stride of a man accustomed to absolute authority. His crisp uniform, adorned with the gold stripes that marked 30 years of service, commanded immediate respect from passengers and crew alike. He approached Gabrielle's seat with what he believed was a professional smile, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his true feelings about the situation. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of countless pre-flight announcements. "I'm Captain Mitchell. I understand there might be some confusion about your seating assignment." Gabrielle looked up from her documents, meeting his gaze with calm professionalism. "Good morning, Captain. There's no confusion on my end. I'm seated exactly where my ticket indicates." Mitchell's smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened slightly. "Well, that's the issue. Our computer system is showing an error with your reservation. We're going to need to move you to accommodate the correction." "I see," Gabrielle replied evenly. "Could you show me the documentation of this computer error? I'd like to understand exactly what the system is indicating." The request caught Mitchell off guard. In his experience, passengers simply complied with crew instructions, especially when delivered by the captain himself. The woman's calm insistence on seeing proof suggested a troublemaker, someone who would make his job more difficult than necessary. "Ma'am, I don't need to provide documentation. As captain of this aircraft, I have the authority to seat passengers where I determine is appropriate." His voice carried a harder edge now, the friendly pretense beginning to slip away. Jessica, Martinez, and David Thompson flanked Mitchell, creating an intimidating presence that drew the attention of every passenger in first class. Cell phones emerged as people began recording, sensing that something significant was unfolding. "I understand you have authority, Captain," Gabrielle said, her voice remaining remarkably steady. However, I also have rights as a paying passenger. If there's truly a computer error, surely you can provide some documentation of that error. Mitchell felt heat rising in his chest. The woman's articulate responses and professional demeanor were making the situation more complicated than he'd anticipated. Worse, she was doing it in front of a cabin full of passengers with cameras, creating exactly the kind of scene he'd hoped to avoid. "Look, lady," he said, dropping the professional facade entirely. "I don't have time for games. This is a first-class cabin, and I need to see proof that you actually belong here." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Several passengers gasped audibly. The implications were clear to everyone present, though Mitchell seemed unaware of how his statement sounded to the listening audience. Gabrielle reached into her purse and withdrew a business card, extending it toward Mitchell. "Perhaps this will help clarify things, Captain." Mitchell glanced at the card dismissively, seeing only the name Gabrielle Washington printed in elegant script. He didn't bother to read the title underneath, assuming it was probably some entry-level position she was trying to inflate. "Anyone can print a business card," he said, handing it back without really looking. "I need to see documentation that proves you paid for this seat legitimately." Robert Sterling leaned forward in his seat, emboldened by the captain's aggressive stance. "Captain, I have to say, this is exactly the kind of problem we're seeing everywhere these days. People trying to take advantage of the system, claiming they belong in places they clearly don't." Margaret Ashford nodded vigorously. "It's so unfair to those of us who actually pay full price for these seats. We work hard for our money." Gabrielle felt the familiar weight of systemic prejudice settling around her like a suffocating blanket. She'd experienced this countless times throughout her career, but it never became easier to endure. The assumption that her success must be illegitimate, that her presence in spaces of privilege required extra justification, cut deeply despite her professional composure. "Captain," she said quietly, "I'm requesting to speak with an airline supervisor about this situation." "There's no supervisor available," Mitchell replied quickly. "I'm the highest authority on this aircraft, and I'm telling you that you need to move to economy class immediately." David Thompson stepped closer, his voice adding to the pressure. "Ma'am, we really need you to comply with the captain's instructions. We have a schedule to maintain." "And if I refuse?" Gabrielle asked. Mitchell's face darkened. "Then I'll call airport security and have you removed from the aircraft entirely. Is that really how you want this to go?" The threat hung heavy in the cabin air. Passengers continued recording, their phones capturing every word of the escalating confrontation. Some looked uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, while others nodded approvingly at the captain's firm stance. Gabrielle pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly. "I'm documenting this interaction for my records. I'm also noting the time, date, and the crew members involved." "You can document whatever you want," Mitchell said dismissively, "but you're still moving to economy or you're getting off my plane." Jessica Martinez leaned in closer. "Ma'am, we really don't want to make this more difficult than it needs to be. We have some very nice seats available in the main cabin." "With legroom," David added, as if offering her a generous upgrade rather than a humiliating demotion. Gabrielle looked around the cabin at the faces staring back at her. Some showed sympathy, others displayed barely concealed hostility, and many simply watched with the detached curiosity of spectators at an unexpected entertainment. She thought about her options. She could comply with their demands, accept the humiliation, and file a complaint later through proper channels. She could refuse and face removal from the aircraft, missing her crucial board meeting tomorrow morning. Or she could continue to stand her ground, maintaining her dignity while documenting every moment of the discrimination she was experiencing. The business card Mitchell had dismissed so casually lay on her tray table, her title clearly visible to anyone who cared to look. Chief Executive Officer, Atlantic Airways. But he hadn't looked, and neither had anyone else. They saw only what their prejudices allowed them to see. "Captain Mitchell," she said finally, "I want to be absolutely clear about what's happening here. You're demanding that I move from a seat I legitimately purchased, based on what you claim is a computer error that you cannot or will not document. Is that correct?" "That's exactly right," Mitchell said, his confidence returning. "And if you don't like it, you can take it up with customer service after the flight." Gabrielle nodded slowly, her decision made. "Then I suppose we'll see how this plays out." She had no idea that in less than 24 hours, she would be sitting across from this same captain in a boardroom, watching his career disintegrate as the full weight of his actions became clear. For now, she simply prepared herself for the humiliation that was about to unfold, unaware that it would ultimately transform an entire industry. The call to airport security took exactly 4 minutes to produce results. Officers Johnson and Peters arrived at the aircraft door with the swift efficiency of personnel accustomed to handling difficult passengers. Their heavy footsteps echoed through the cabin as they made their way toward first class, creating an atmosphere of intimidation that settled over the watching passengers like a dark cloud. Officer Johnson, a stocky man with graying temples, approached Gabrielle's seat with his hand resting casually on his radio. "Ma'am, we understand there's a seating dispute. We're here to help resolve the situation." "Thank you, officer," Gabrielle replied calmly. "I'm seated in the seat indicated on my boarding pass, which I purchased legitimately. The captain claims there's a computer error, but refuses to provide any documentation of that error." Officer Peters, younger and clearly eager to defer to Captain Mitchell's authority, stepped forward. "Captain, what's the situation here?" Mitchell's expression conveyed the weary frustration of a professional dealing with an unreasonable passenger. "Officers, this woman is refusing to comply with crew instructions. She's seated in first class, but our system shows an error with her reservation. When asked to move to an appropriate seat, she became argumentative and disruptive." The narrative was skillfully crafted, painting Gabrielle as the aggressor while positioning Mitchell as the reasonable authority figure simply trying to maintain order. The officers nodded, having heard similar stories countless times. "Ma'am," Officer Johnson said, "we need you to cooperate with the flight crew. If there's an issue with your ticket, we can sort it out at the gate." Gabrielle felt the weight of institutional bias pressing down on her. The officers had made their decision before hearing her side of the story, automatically siding with the white authority figure over the black passenger. She'd seen this pattern play out in boardrooms, in courthouses, and now at 30,000 feet in the air. "Officers, I'd like you to examine my boarding pass and identification," she said, retrieving both documents. "You'll see that everything is in order." Officer Peters glanced at the documents perfunctorily. "These look fine, ma'am, but the captain says there's a computer error. We need to trust the crew's judgment here." Around the cabin, passengers continued recording with their phones. Some had already begun posting to social media, their captions ranging from supportive to critical. The hashtag #Atlantic Airways discrimination was already beginning to trend, though none of the principals in the drama were yet aware of the viral storm brewing online. A young woman in seat 4B stood up boldly. "Excuse me, officers, but I've been watching this whole thing. This lady hasn't been disruptive at all. She's been completely polite and professional while being treated terribly." "Ma'am, please sit down," Officer Johnson said firmly. "This doesn't concern you." But her courage had inspired others. An elderly gentleman in 3A cleared his throat. "I have to agree. I've seen no evidence of disruptive behavior. The captain seems to be the one escalating the situation." Margaret Ashford quickly contradicted him. "That's not true at all. She's been argumentative from the moment she got on the plane. Some people just don't know their place." The comment drew sharp looks from several passengers, its implications clear to everyone present. Robert Sterling nodded approvingly, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Captain Mitchell seized on the divided passenger response. "You see, officers, she's creating disruption throughout the cabin. We need to resolve this immediately." Gabrielle realized that continuing to resist would only lead to her arrest and removal from the flight entirely. She thought about the board meeting tomorrow morning, the crucial decisions that needed her presence, the quarterly projections that required her approval. Sometimes fighting the system meant picking your battles strategically. "I'll move," she said quietly, gathering her documents and belongings. The officers relaxed visibly, having achieved their objective without further conflict. Captain Mitchell smiled with satisfaction. his authority validated, and his aircraft back under control. "Thank you for your cooperation, ma'am," Officer Johnson said. "That's the right decision." As Gabrielle stood to leave her seat, the young woman who had spoken up earlier called out, "This is wrong. Everyone can see this is wrong." But her protests were drowned out by the rustle of passengers settling back into their seats and the crew's efficient efforts to restore normal cabin operations. The show was over, and people were eager to return to their phones, their magazines, their comfortable assumptions about how the world worked. Jessica Martinez led Gabrielle toward economy class with barely concealed triumph. "I have a nice middle seat for you in row 27, she said sweetly, right between a mother with a crying baby and a gentleman who takes up quite a bit of space. The seating assignment was clearly punitive, designed to make Gabrielle's flight as uncomfortable as possible. She accepted it without comment, maintaining her dignity, even as passengers throughout the cabin craned their necks to watch her walk of shame toward the back of the aircraft. As she settled into the cramped middle seat, squeezed between a screaming infant and a large man whose elbows encroached on her space, Gabrielle could hear the first-class crew celebrating their victory in hushed tones. "Can you believe the nerve of some people?" Jessica whispered to David, acting like she belonged up there with the real first-class passengers. "The captain handled it perfectly," David replied, "professional and firm. That's leadership." Captain Mitchell returned to the cockpit with the swagger of a man who had successfully maintained order and upheld standards. He would file a report, describing a disruptive passenger who had attempted to occupy premium seating without authorization, been given multiple opportunities to comply with crew instructions, and finally been moved to appropriate accommodations with the assistance of law enforcement. But as Flight 447 taxied toward the runway, Gabrielle was methodically documenting every detail of what had transpired. Her phone contained photos of the crew members, recordings of their conversations, precise timestamps of each interaction, and contact information from sympathetic passengers who had offered to serve as witnesses. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from Marcus Williams. "Ms. Washington, I wanted to confirm your arrival time tomorrow morning. The board is particularly eager to discuss the diversity initiatives." "I'll be there, Marcus," she said quietly, aware that nearby passengers were listening. "And I think our discussion about company culture is going to be more important than anyone realizes. Is everything all right? You sound stressed." Gabrielle glanced around the economy cabin at the cramped conditions she'd been forced to endure, at the crew members who continued to glance back at her with smug satisfaction. "Let's just say I've gained some valuable first-hand insight into the passenger experience," she said. "It's going to inform some significant changes in company policy." As the aircraft lifted off from Atlanta, bound for New York, none of the crew members who had participated in Gabrielle's humiliation had any idea that they had just sealed their own fates. The woman they'd dismissed as a troublemaker, the passenger they'd treated as inherently suspicious, the person they'd humiliated in front of a cabin full of witnesses, was about to reshape their world in ways they couldn't imagine. What do you think about Captain Mitchell's actions? Comment number 1 if you believe he was following proper protocol, or comment number 2 if you think his behavior crossed the line into discrimination. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories of justice and redemption. Because what happens next will shock you to your core and prove that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice comes from the most unexpected places. But how far would you go to right a wrong like this? The morning sun painted Manhattan's skyline in shades of gold and amber as Gabrielle Washington stepped out of her taxi in front of the Atlantic Airways corporate headquarters. The gleaming 40-story tower of glass and steel stood as a monument to aviation success, its facade reflecting the bustling energy of the city around it. Employees streamed through the revolving doors, beginning another day in what they believed was just another week at one of America's leading airlines. Gabrielle paused on the sidewalk, her briefcase containing not only the quarterly report she'd planned to review, but also a comprehensive documentation of yesterday's discrimination that would forever change the company she led. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was entering her own headquarters as an anonymous passenger seeking justice. The lobby buzzed with typical corporate energy. Employees chatted over coffee, their voices mixing with the click of heels on marble floors and the soft hum of elevator machinery. A massive bronze sculpture of an airplane dominated the central space, surrounded by photographs celebrating Atlantic Airways' rich history of innovation and service excellence. Gabrielle approached the reception desk where a young woman named Amanda sat behind a computer screen, her Atlantic Airways uniform crisp and professional. "Good morning," Gabrielle said politely. "I need to file a passenger complaint about discrimination I experienced on yesterday's flight." Amanda looked up with the practiced expression of someone accustomed to handling upset travelers. "Of course, ma'am. Let me direct you to our customer service department on the 3rd floor. They'll be able to help you with any concerns." The flighty elevator ride to the 3rd floor gave Gabrielle time to reflect on the peculiar situation she found herself in. As CEO, she typically entered the building through the executive garage, taking her private elevator directly to the 42nd floor. Now she was experiencing the company from an entirely different perspective, seeing how Atlantic Airways treated ordinary passengers seeking resolution to their grievances. The customer service department occupied a modest suite of offices designed with efficiency rather than comfort in mind. The waiting area contained plastic chairs arranged in rows, fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows, and motivational posters encouraging patience and understanding. A small television mounted in the corner played a continuous loop of Atlantic Airways promotional videos featuring happy families and successful business travelers. Janet Foster emerged from her office to greet Gabrielle, her smile bright but clearly routine. As customer service manager, Janet had handled thousands of passenger complaints over her 15-year career with the airline. She'd developed a systematic approach to managing upset travelers, focusing on quick resolution and minimal company liability. "Please come into my office," Janet said, leading Gabrielle into a cramped space dominated by filing cabinets and computer monitors. "I understand you had an unsatisfactory experience on one of our flights." Gabrielle settled into the uncomfortable chair across from Janet's desk. "Yesterday on Flight 447 from Atlanta to New York, I was subjected to discriminatory treatment by your flight crew, publicly humiliated, and forced to move from my legitimately purchased first-class seat based on false claims of computer errors." Janet's expression remained professionally neutral as she opened a new file on her computer. "I'm sorry to hear about your negative experience. Can you provide me with your confirmation number and flight details?" As Gabrielle recited the information, Janet's fingers moved efficiently across the keyboard, pulling up the flight manifest and crew reports. Her screen displayed the official version of events as recorded by Captain Mitchell. Passenger in first class became argumentative when informed of seating error. Situation resolved with assistance of law enforcement. Passenger moved to appropriate seating without incident. "I see here that there was indeed a seating issue that required crew intervention," Janet said, reading from Mitchell's report. "According to our records, the situation was handled professionally and in accordance with company policy." "That's interesting," Gabrielle replied calmly, "because I have video evidence from multiple passengers that tells a very different story. I also have recordings of crew members making discriminatory comments throughout the flight." Janet's professional demeanor flickered slightly. Most passenger complaints involved hurt feelings and requests for meal vouchers. Allegations of discrimination backed by video evidence required more careful handling. "Well, let's see what we can do to address your concerns," Janet said, switching to damage control mode. "I can offer you a full refund for your ticket, plus a travel voucher for future flights and of course a formal apology from the company." Gabrielle shook her head. "I'm not interested in compensation. I want a full investigation into the conduct of Captain Mitchell and his crew. I want to see the documentation of the computer error they claimed justified moving me from my seat." "Ma'am, I appreciate your frustration, but our pilots are highly trained professionals. If Captain Mitchell reported a seating error, I'm confident his actions were appropriate." "Then you'll have no problem providing the documentation of that error," Gabrielle said evenly. "Surely your computer systems maintain logs of booking irregularities and the corrections made to address them." Janet shifted uncomfortably in her chair. In 15 years of handling complaints, she'd never had a passenger make such specific technical requests. Most people accepted vouchers and apologies, eager to put unpleasant experiences behind them. "That type of technical information isn't typically shared with passengers," Janet explained. "It's proprietary company data. I see, Gabrielle said, making notes in a small pad. So when your crew claims a computer error justifies removing a passenger from their seat, there's no requirement to provide evidence of that error? Our crew members have the training and authority to make operational decisions, Janet replied, beginning to sound defensive. We trust their professional judgment, even when that judgment appears to be influenced by racial bias. The question hung in the air between them. Janet had dealt with discrimination complaints before, but they were usually handled delicately, resolved with generous compensation packages, and carefully worded non-admission settlements. Ma'am, Atlantic Airways has a strict non-discrimination policy, Janet said, reciting the corporate line she'd memorized. We serve passengers of all backgrounds with equal respect and professionalism. That's reassuring to hear, Gabrielle said. I'd like to speak with your regional manager about implementing the investigation I've requested. Janet's discomfort was growing by the minute. The woman across from her desk wasn't behaving like a typical upset passenger. Her questions were too precise, her demeanor too professional, her knowledge of corporate procedures too sophisticated. Let me call Mr. Crawford, Janet said, reaching for her phone. He might be able to provide additional assistance. Thomas Crawford arrived 10 minutes later, his expensive suit and confident bearing marking him as senior management. He'd built his career on his ability to handle difficult situations diplomatically, turning angry passengers into satisfied customers with a combination of charm and carefully calculated compensation. Ms. Washington, he said, extending his hand with a politician's smile. Tom Crawford, regional manager. Janet tells me you had some concerns about your flight experience. Gabrielle shook his hand firmly. Mr. Crawford, I experienced blatant racial discrimination on one of your flights. I was publicly humiliated, forced from my legitimate seat, and subjected to treatment that no passenger should endure. I'm requesting a comprehensive investigation. Crawford settled into the chair, beside Janet's desk, his expression conveying sympathy and understanding. That sounds absolutely terrible. I want you to know that we take these allegations very seriously. Seriously enough to provide documentation of the computer error your captain claimed justified his actions? Well, as Janet mentioned, that technical information is proprietary, but I can offer you something much better. Crawford leaned forward conspiratorially. A full refund, $5,000 in travel vouchers, an upgrade to first class on all future flights, and a personal letter of apology from our CEO. The offer was generous by industry standards, designed to resolve the complaint quickly and quietly. Crawford had used similar packages to settle dozens of discrimination complaints over the years, avoiding negative publicity and legal complications. I'm not interested in compensation, Gabrielle said firmly. I want accountability. I want the crew members who discriminated against me to face consequences for their actions. Crawford's smile remained in place, but his eyes hardened slightly. Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but making accusations against our crew members is a serious matter. If you continue down this path, you might find yourself facing legal action for defamation. The threat was subtle but clear. Gabrielle had encountered similar intimidation tactics throughout her career. Powerful men using their positions to silence critics and protect the status quo. Are you threatening me, Mr. Crawford? Not at all, he replied smoothly. I'm simply pointing out that false allegations can have consequences. Our pilots and flight attendants are professionals with excellent reputations. Unfounded attacks on their character won't be tolerated. Gabrielle checked her watch. I'd like to speak with your CEO about this matter. Crawford laughed dismissively. The CEO doesn't handle passenger complaints. That's what we're here for. And frankly, I think you're being unreasonable. We've offered you very generous compensation. I haven't asked for compensation, Gabrielle pointed out. I've asked for an investigation and accountability. Well, you're not going to get either, Crawford said, his patience finally exhausted. If you don't like our resolution, you're welcome to file a complaint with the Department of Transportation. Good luck with that. Gabrielle stood slowly, gathering her belongings. Mr. Crawford, you mentioned that your CEO doesn't handle passenger complaints. That's right, too busy running a major airline. I see, Gabrielle said, moving toward the door. Well, perhaps it's time for that to change. As she left the customer service office, Crawford and Foster exchanged satisfied looks. Another difficult passenger handled. Another potential lawsuit avoided. They had no idea that they had just made the biggest mistake of their professional careers. Gabrielle walked calmly to the elevator bank, but instead of pressing the button for the lobby, she inserted a special keycard and selected the 42nd floor. The executive elevator whisked her upward toward a confrontation that would reshape Atlantic Airways forever. In her pocket, her phone contained recordings of every word Crawford and Foster had spoken, documented evidence of their dismissive attitudes and intimidation tactics. They thought they had silenced another complaint. Instead, they had just sealed their own fates. The elevator doors opened to reveal the executive floor of Atlantic Airways, where Gabrielle Washington was about to reclaim her power and transform an industry. The executive floor of Atlantic Airways hummed with the quiet efficiency of corporate power. Persian rugs adorned polished hardwood floors, original artwork lined the walls, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of Manhattan's skyline. This was where the real decisions were made, where strategy was crafted, where the future of aviation was shaped by minds that understood the delicate balance between profit and purpose. Gabrielle's heels clicked authoritatively on the marble as she approached the executive suite. The contrast between this opulent environment and the cramped customer service office 3 floors below couldn't have been more stark. Up here, problems were solved with decisive action rather than damage control and deflection. Marcus Williams looked up from his desk as Gabrielle emerged from the elevator, his face breaking into a warm smile of recognition. As her personal assistant for the past 3 years, Marcus had developed an almost intuitive understanding of his boss's moods and methods. Today, something in her expression suggested that major changes were coming. "Good morning, Ms. Washington," he said, rising to greet her. "The board members have been arriving for the past 30 minutes. They're eager to discuss the quarterly projections and the diversity initiative progress." "Marcus," Gabrielle said, her voice carrying an edge that made him pay closer attention, "I think today's discussion is going to be more illuminating than anyone expects." Before he could respond, the elevator behind Gabrielle dinged softly. Thomas Crawford and Janet Foster stepped out, their faces flushed from the rapid ascent and their expressions confused by their sudden summons to the executive floor. "Excuse me," Crawford said, approaching Marcus's desk with forced confidence. "We received an urgent message to report to the CEO's office immediately. There must be some mistake." Marcus glanced at Gabrielle, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "No mistake, Mr. Crawford. Please follow me." The group moved toward the corner office, passing the conference room where board members could be seen gathering around the polished mahogany table. Crawford and Foster exchanged puzzled looks, uncertain why a passenger complaint would require executive attention. Gabrielle paused at the threshold of her office, allowing Crawford and Foster to enter first. The spacious room was decorated with aviation memorabilia and awards recognizing Atlantic Airways' industry leadership. Behind the massive desk, a nameplate gleamed in the morning sunlight. Gabrielle Washington, Chief Executive Officer. The realization hit Crawford like a physical blow. His face drained of color as he stared at the nameplate, then at Gabrielle, then back at the nameplate again. Foster made a small, choking sound, her hand flying to her throat as the full implications became clear. "Please have a seat," Gabrielle said calmly, settling into her executive chair with the natural authority of someone accustomed to command. Crawford and Foster remained standing, too shocked to move. The passenger they had dismissed, threatened, and attempted to silence with intimidation tactics was the CEO of the entire company. Their careers, their livelihoods, their professional reputations hung in the balance of the next few minutes. "Ms. Washington," Crawford began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I had no idea." "Obviously," Gabrielle replied coolly, which raises some interesting questions about how this company treats passengers who don't arrive with CEO credentials. Marcus Williams entered the office carrying a tablet loaded with preliminary data from the investigation Gabrielle had authorized that morning. Ma'am, the initial findings are quite disturbing. Should I present them now or wait for the board? Now is fine, Marcus. Mr. Crawford and Ms. Foster should hear this. Marcus consulted his tablet, his expression grave. We've analyzed passenger complaints from the past 12 months, cross-referenced with crew assignments and passenger demographics. The pattern is unmistakable. Crawford sank into a chair, his legs no longer able to support him. Foster remained, standing, swaying slightly as if the floor beneath her feet had become unstable. Captain Mitchell has been involved in 17 separate incidents involving minority passengers over the past year, Marcus continued. Flight attendants Martinez and Thompson have similar patterns. The complaints were all handled by the customer service department with minimal investigation and settlement packages designed to avoid publicity. 17 incidents, Gabrielle repeated, her voice deadly quiet. And what was the resolution rate for those complaints? 0 formal investigations, 0 disciplinary actions, 0 policy changes. Foster found her voice, though it came out as a croak. Ms. Washington, I followed standard procedures. We've always handled complaints that way. Standard procedures, Gabrielle mused. Marcus, what's the standard procedure when a CEO experiences discrimination on her own airline? I believe we're creating new precedent, ma'am. The intercom on Gabrielle's desk buzzed softly. Ms. Washington, came the voice of her secretary. The board is ready for you. Tell them we'll need an emergency session format, Gabrielle replied. And ask them to prepare for a comprehensive discussion of company culture and operational standards. Crawford attempted one last desperate plea. Ms. Washington, surely we can resolve this internally. There's no need to involve the board in what amounts to a misunderstanding. Gabrielle's laugh was cold and humorless. Mr. Crawford, this stopped being a misunderstanding the moment you threatened me with legal action for seeking accountability. This became a systemic failure the moment we discovered 17 similar incidents with 0 consequences. She stood, gathering the files Marcus had prepared. You're both suspended pending a full investigation. HR will contact you about the formal disciplinary process. As Crawford and Foster were escorted from the office by security, Gabrielle prepared for the most important board presentation of her career. The quarterly projections and diversity initiatives that had been the original agenda would now be overshadowed by a real-time case study in corporate discrimination and the urgent need for transformational change. The irony wasn't lost on her that yesterday's humiliation had become today's catalyst for industry reform. Sometimes the most powerful lessons came from the most unexpected sources, and sometimes the best way to change a system was to experience its failures firsthand. She thought about Captain Mitchell, probably preparing for another routine flight, unaware that his career was about to end in spectacular fashion. She thought about the passengers who had witnessed yesterday's discrimination, many of whom had already shared their videos on social media, creating a viral storm that was about to engulf Atlantic Airways. Most of all, she thought about the young black girl in economy class who had asked her mother why the lady was being treated badly. That child deserved to grow up in a world where her skin color didn't determine her treatment, where her success wouldn't be questioned, where her presence in spaces of privilege wouldn't require extra justification. As Gabrielle walked toward the boardroom, she carried with her not just the weight of corporate responsibility, but the power to transform an entire industry. The woman who had been humiliated in seat 2A was about to reshape the world of aviation, one policy change at a time. The board members had no idea that they were about to witness history in the making. The Atlantic Airways boardroom had hosted countless meetings over the decades, witnessing strategic decisions that shaped the airline industry and financial discussions that moved markets. But as Gabrielle Washington entered with Marcus Williams, trailing behind, carrying tablets loaded with explosive evidence, the atmosphere crackled with an energy that suggested this meeting would be unlike any other in the company's history. The 12 board members sat around the polished mahogany table, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned. CFO Patricia Hayes, COO Michael Torres, and Chairman of the Board Douglas Whitman had all received urgent messages that morning, indicating a major operational crisis requiring immediate attention. Ladies and gentlemen, Gabrielle began, her voice carrying the calm authority that had made her one of the youngest CEOs in aviation history. "Thank you for accommodating this emergency session. What I'm about to share with you will require decisive action and fundamental changes to our corporate structure." Before she could continue, her assistant received an urgent message on his phone. "Ma'am," Marcus whispered, "Captain Mitchell has just arrived. Security is escorting him to conference room B as requested." Douglas Whitman leaned forward in his chair. "Gabrielle, what exactly is the nature of this emergency?" The message we received mentioned operational irregularities and potential legal exposure. Gabrielle activated the room's presentation system, displaying the first slide of what would become a landmark case study in corporate discrimination. "Yesterday, I flew from Atlanta to New York on Flight 447. What I experienced during that flight represents a systemic failure of our values, our training, and our commitment to equal treatment of all passengers." She methodically recounted the events, from the suspicious scrutiny at the gate to the humiliating removal from first class. As she spoke, board members' expressions shifted from confusion to shock to outright horror. These weren't abstract discrimination statistics they were reviewing. This was their CEO describing her personal experience of bias within their own company. "The captain demanded I move based on a supposed computer error that he could not and would not document," Gabrielle continued. "When I requested evidence, I was threatened with removal from the aircraft entirely." Patricia Hayes, a black woman who had broken numerous barriers in her own rise to CFO, spoke first. "Gabrielle, this is absolutely unacceptable. But I have to ask, did the crew know who you were?" "That's precisely the point, Patricia. They didn't know, and it shouldn't matter. Every passenger deserves the same respect and dignity, regardless of their title or position." Michael Torres pulled out his phone, already scrolling through social media feeds. "The videos are everywhere. Atlantic Airways discrimination is trending nationally. Our stock price has dropped 12% since the markets opened." Marcus distributed tablets to each board member, loaded with the preliminary investigation results. "The data reveals a pattern of discriminatory behavior that extends far beyond yesterday's incident. We have documented cases involving multiple crew members over an extended period." As board members reviewed the evidence, their faces reflected growing alarm. The company they had helped build, the values they thought they had instilled, the culture they believed they had created, all of it was being called into question by irrefutable data. "How many incidents are we talking about?" asked board member Sarah Chen, her expertise in legal affairs making her immediately concerned about liability exposure. 17 documented cases involving Captain Mitchell alone," Marcus replied. "Similar patterns with other crew members. The customer service department has been systematically settling complaints with compensation packages designed to avoid investigation." Chairman Whitman's face was grave. "What's our immediate exposure here?" Before Gabrielle could answer, her phone buzzed with another urgent message. "Captain Mitchell is demanding to know why he's been summoned. He's insisting he did nothing wrong and followed all company procedures." The timing was perfect. Gabrielle looked around the table at the board members who would help decide the future of Atlantic Airways. "I think it's time for Captain Mitchell to join our discussion." 2 minutes later, Captain Derek Mitchell entered the boardroom with the confident stride of a man who believed his 30-year career and spotless safety record would protect him from any passenger complaint. He'd been through this before, routine meetings where company executives rubber-stamped his professional judgment and sent complaining passengers on their way with vouchers and apologies. His confidence evaporated the moment he saw Gabrielle, seated at the head of the table, her CEO nameplate clearly visible, her eyes meeting his with cool assessment. The color drained from his face as the full reality of his situation became clear. "Captain Mitchell," Gabrielle said calmly, "thank you for joining us. I believe you and I met yesterday on Flight 447. Mitchell's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the back of a chair, his legs suddenly unreliable. The passenger he had humiliated, the woman he had dismissed as a troublemaker, the person he had threatened with removal, was the CEO of Atlantic Airways. "Ms. Washington," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper, I had no idea. No idea that I was the CEO? Gabrielle asked. Or no idea that your behavior was discriminatory and unacceptable? Douglas Whitman gestured to an empty chair. Captain, please sit down. We need to discuss yesterday's incident and its implications for your continued employment with this company. Mitchell collapsed into the chair, his 3 decades of confidence and authority crumbling before the assembled executives. I followed company protocol. I made a judgment call about passenger seating based on operational concerns. Patricia Hayes consulted her tablet. Captain, according to our investigation, you claim there was a computer error with Ms. Washington's reservation. Can you provide documentation of that error? There was. The system showed. Mitchell stammered, unable to construct a coherent response. There was no computer error, Michael Torres stated flatly. Our IT department has confirmed that Ms. Washington's reservation was processed correctly and remained valid throughout the entire booking process. The weight of his lie settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Mitchell had fabricated the computer error story to justify his discriminatory behavior, never imagining he would be called upon to provide evidence. Sarah Chen leaned forward, her legal training evident in her precise questioning. Captain Mitchell, are you aware that creating false documentation or making false statements about passenger reservations constitutes a violation of both company policy and federal aviation regulations? Mitchell's career was disintegrating before his eyes. The safety record he'd built over 3 decades, the respect he'd earned from colleagues, the retirement he'd planned, all of it was collapsing because of one moment of prejudice that he'd never thought would be challenged. I want you to understand something very clearly, Captain, Gabrielle said, her voice cutting through his desperation. This isn't just about yesterday's incident. We've identified a pattern of discriminatory behavior that spans months. You've targeted minority passengers repeatedly, and this company has failed to address it. Marcus activated the presentation system, displaying a timeline of Mitchell's interactions with Black, Latino, and Asian passengers over the past year. The pattern was undeniable, the discrimination systematic. 17 incidents, Gabrielle continued. 17 times you questioned the legitimacy of minority passengers in first class. 17 times you demanded additional documentation. 17 times you made assumptions based on skin color rather than facts. The board members sat in stunned silence as the full scope of Mitchell's behavior became clear. This wasn't an isolated incident or a misunderstanding. It was evidence of deep-seated bias that had been allowed to flourish unchecked. Mitchell made one final desperate attempt to save his career. Ms. Washington, I've been flying for 30 years. I've never had a safety incident, never had a complaint upheld against me. Surely my record means something. Gabrielle's response was swift and decisive. Captain Mitchell, your employment with Atlantic Airways is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. You'll receive information about the formal disciplinary process and any potential legal consequences. As security officers entered to escort Mitchell from the boardroom, Gabrielle turned to address the board members who would help her reshape the company's future. What's your opinion on how this situation should be handled? Comment number 1, if you think Captain Mitchell deserved to be fired, or comment number 2 if you believe his punishment was too severe. Hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens next will show you the true power of standing up for what's right. But the real question is, how do you transform an entire industry after exposing this level of systemic discrimination? The termination of Captain Derek Mitchell sent shockwaves through Atlantic Airways that reverberated far beyond the corporate headquarters. Within hours, news of the discrimination incident and the dramatic revelation of the CEO's identity had exploded across social media platforms, traditional news outlets, and aviation industry publications. The story had everything that captured public attention: injustice, power dynamics, corporate accountability, and a stunning reversal of fortune. In the Atlantic Airways Communications Department, Director of Public Relations Emma Rodriguez worked frantically to manage the crisis. Her phone rang continuously with interview requests from CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and every major newspaper in the country. The company's stock price continued its downward spiral as investors worried about potential lawsuits, federal investigations, and long-term damage to the brand. Emma, called her assistant from across the bustling crisis management center. "We have confirmed requests from 67 media outlets for interviews with the CEO. Social media mentions have exceeded 2 million in the past 6 hours. The hashtag #ChoreAtlantic Airways discrimination had evolved into something much larger than a single incident. Passengers were sharing their own stories of airline discrimination, creating a virtual avalanche of testimony about bias in the aviation industry. Flight attendants from competing airlines were coming forward with accounts of discriminatory training practices and unwritten policies that targeted minority passengers. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment in suburban Atlanta, Captain Derek Mitchell sat in his recliner, watching his career disintegrate on live television. The local news was interviewing passengers from Flight 447, their cell phone videos playing on a continuous loop that showed his confrontation with Gabrielle Washington in devastating detail. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," said the young woman who had defended Gabrielle during the incident. "This lady was being treated terribly, and everyone could see it was because of her race. The captain was so arrogant, so dismissive, he acted like she didn't belong there." Mitchell's wife, Linda, brought him a cup of coffee with trembling hands. "Derek, the neighbors are starting to talk. Mrs. Henderson from next door asked me if it was really you on the news." 30 years, Mitchell muttered, his eyes fixed on the television screen. 30 years of perfect safety records, commendations, passenger compliments, all destroyed because of one misunderstanding. But even as he spoke the words, Mitchell knew they weren't true. It hadn't been a misunderstanding. It had been prejudice, pure and simple. He'd seen a well-dressed black woman in first class and assumed she didn't belong there. The assumption had felt so natural, so obvious, that he'd never questioned it. His phone rang, displaying the number of his attorney. "Derek, I've been watching the news. We need to talk immediately. The company isn't just firing you. They're considering criminal charges for filing false reports about computer errors." Back at Atlantic Airways headquarters, Gabrielle faced the media with the same calm professionalism she'd maintained throughout the ordeal. The main conference room had been converted into a press briefing center, with cameras from major networks capturing every word of what would become a landmark moment in corporate accountability. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gabrielle began, addressing the packed room of reporters. "Yesterday, I experienced firsthand the discrimination that too many passengers face when traveling with airlines across this industry. Today, we begin the process of ensuring it never happens again." A reporter from the Washington Post raised her hand. "Ms. Washington, critics are saying this is just one isolated incident being blown out of proportion. How do you respond to that?" Gabrielle activated the room's presentation system, displaying comprehensive data that Marcus Williams and the investigation team had compiled throughout the day. "Our analysis reveals 17 separate incidents involving Captain Mitchell alone over the past 12 months. Similar patterns exist with other crew members. This is not isolated, it's systematic." CNN's aviation correspondent pressed further. "What specific changes will Atlantic Airways implement to address these issues?" "Effective immediately, we're instituting a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind," Gabrielle announced. "Every employee will undergo mandatory bias training within the next 60 days. We're establishing an independent oversight committee to review passenger complaints and ensure proper investigation of discrimination allegations." The questions continued for nearly an hour, with Gabrielle fielding inquiries about financial impact, legal liability, and industry-wide implications. Throughout the session, she maintained the composed leadership that had impressed the board of directors and was now winning over a skeptical public. In the Flight Operations Center, the immediate effects of the crisis were becoming apparent. Flight attendants Jessica Martinez and David Thompson had been suspended pending investigation, their confident discrimination from yesterday replaced by anxiety about their futures. Other crew members whispered nervously about their own interactions with minority passengers, wondering if their behavior would be scrutinized. The ripple effects extended far beyond Atlantic Airways. United Airlines announced an immediate review of their discrimination complaint procedures. Delta issued a statement reaffirming their commitment to equal treatment. Southwest launched a company-wide bias training program. The entire industry was scrambling to avoid becoming the next target of public outrage. Robert Sterling, The businessman who had made racist comments during the flight found his own life under scrutiny. His company's board of directors called an emergency meeting after his statements went viral, their corporate clients expressing concern about being associated with his views. His wife fielded angry calls from friends and neighbors who had seen the videos online. Margaret Ashford faced similar consequences in her social circles. The wealthy socialite who had initially seemed to support Gabrielle before backing down under pressure discovered that her wishy-washy response to discrimination carried its own price. Invitations to charity galas dried up. Country club committees quietly removed her from leadership positions. But perhaps the most powerful impact was on the young black girl who had questioned her mother about the lady being treated badly. 8-year-old Zoe Williams had watched the news coverage with fascination, learning that the woman she'd seen humiliated was actually the CEO of the entire airline. "Mommy," Zoe said during dinner, "can I be a pilot when I grow up?" Her mother, Dr. Angela Williams, smiled through tears she didn't try to hide. "Baby, you can be anything you want to be, and now you know that there are people like Ms. Washington making sure you'll be treated fairly while you do it." The Federal Aviation Administration announced that evening that they would conduct a comprehensive investigation into discrimination practices across the airline industry. The Department of Transportation opened parallel civil rights inquiries. Congressional leaders called for hearings on airline accountability and passenger rights. As night fell over New York City, Gabrielle stood in her office reviewing the day's developments with Marcus Williams. The city lights twinkled beyond her windows, each point of illumination representing lives that might be changed by the events set in motion by one moment of standing up to injustice. "Ma'am," Marcus said, consulting his tablet. "The initial public response has been overwhelmingly positive. Passenger bookings for tomorrow are actually up 15% compared to last week." Gabrielle nodded, but her thoughts weren't on profit margins or stock prices. She was thinking about the systemic changes needed to ensure that no other passenger would face the humiliation she'd experienced. She was planning the transformation of an entire industry, one policy at a time. The woman who had been forced from seat 2A had become the architect of aviation equality. And this was only the beginning. 6 months after the incident that shocked the aviation world, Atlantic Airways had become an unrecognizable version of its former self. The corporate headquarters buzzed with a different kind of energy, one driven by purpose rather than mere profit. The halls that had once echoed with conversations about quarterly earnings now resonated with discussions about diversity metrics, cultural sensitivity, and systemic reform. Gabrielle Washington stood before a packed auditorium at Harvard Business School, delivering a keynote address that had been sold out for months. The audience of MBA students, corporate executives, and civil rights leaders hung on every word as she recounted the journey from humiliation to transformation. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she told the captivated audience. "But when it does happen, when an organization commits completely to reimagining itself, the results can exceed every expectation." The numbers spoke for themselves. Atlantic Airways employee demographics had shifted dramatically, with minority representation in leadership positions increasing by 250%. Customer satisfaction scores had reached record highs, not just among minority passengers, but across all demographic groups. The company's stock price had not only recovered from its initial crisis dip, but had soared to all-time highs as investors recognized the value of inclusive business practices. "We discovered something that shouldn't have been surprising," Gabrielle continued. "When you treat all of your customers with genuine respect and dignity, when your workforce reflects the diversity of the communities you serve, when you eliminate the barriers that prevent people from reaching their full potential, everybody wins." In the audience, Dr. Angela Williams sat with her daughter Zoe, now 9 years old, and more determined than ever to become a pilot. The scholarship program that Atlantic Airways had established in Zoe's name had already provided flight training opportunities to 50 young people from underrepresented communities. "Mommy," Zoe whispered during a pause in the presentation, "I want to fly planes for Ms. Washington's company." "I know you do, baby," Angela whispered back. "And now you actually can." 3,000 miles away, in a small apartment in Denver, Derek Mitchell watched the Harvard presentation on his laptop computer. The man who had once commanded respect in airline cockpits across the country now worked part-time at a shipping company, his aviation career permanently grounded by his moment of prejudice. His attempts to find employment with other airlines had failed repeatedly. The viral videos of his confrontation with Gabrielle Washington had made him unemployable in the industry he'd served for 3 decades. Background checks revealed the incident immediately, and no company wanted the liability of hiring someone associated with such public discrimination. It could have been different, he muttered to himself, remembering the business card Gabrielle had offered him during the flight. If he had simply looked at it, if he had taken 30 seconds to read her title, his entire life would have followed a different path. But even as he wallowed in self-pity, Mitchell couldn't escape the growing realization that the problem hadn't been his failure to recognize Gabrielle's authority. The problem had been his assumption that she didn't belong in first class at all. The prejudice that destroyed his career had been building for years, expressed in countless small moments of bias that had gone unchallenged until he encountered someone with the power to demand accountability. Jessica Martinez and David Thompson had faced similar consequences. Both flight attendants had been terminated during the investigation that followed Gabrielle's experience. Their attempts to find work in the service industry had been hampered by the same viral videos that had destroyed Mitchell's reputation. "We were just following his lead," Jessica complained to her unemployment counselor. "The captain made the decision. We were just doing our jobs." But the investigation had revealed that both flight attendants had histories of treating minority passengers differently, patterns of behavior that suggested their participation in Gabrielle's humiliation wasn't simply following orders. They had been active participants in a culture of discrimination that Atlantic Airways was now working aggressively to eliminate. The transformation extended far beyond individual careers. The airline industry as a whole had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about institutional bias. Congressional hearings had exposed discriminatory practices at multiple carriers, leading to new federal regulations requiring standardized bias training and independent oversight of passenger complaint procedures. Other industries had taken notice as well. Hotels, restaurants, retail chains, and financial institutions had all implemented similar reforms, recognizing that the Atlantic Airways model offered both moral and economic benefits. The business case for inclusive practices had never been clearer. At the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., a new exhibit opened featuring the story of Gabrielle Washington's experience and its aftermath. Visitors could watch the original cell phone videos from Flight 447, review the comprehensive reforms implemented by Atlantic Airways, and learn about the ongoing fight for equality in corporate America. The exhibit's centerpiece was a replica of Airplane Seat 2A, the place where one woman's refusal to accept discrimination had sparked industry-wide change. A placard beside the seat read, "Sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is simply refusing to be moved." Robert Sterling had faced his own reckoning in the months following the incident. His racist comments, captured on multiple cell phone videos, had cost him his position as CEO of a major investment firm. His board of directors, facing pressure from institutional investors and pension funds, had concluded that his presence was incompatible with their diversity and inclusion commitments. "I was having a bad day," Sterling had told the Wall Street Journal in a desperate attempt to rehabilitate his image. "Those comments don't reflect my true beliefs or values." But the public wasn't buying his belated apologies. The investment firm he'd built over 20 years was hemorrhaging clients, and his personal wealth had declined by 40% as his business empire crumbled around him. Margaret Ashford had fared somewhat better, though her social standing had never fully recovered. The wealthy socialite had attempted to reinvent herself as a champion of civil rights, making large donations to minority-focused charities and speaking at diversity conferences. But her transformation felt calculated rather than genuine, and many in her former social circles viewed her advocacy with suspicion. The ripple effects of that day continued to expand in ways no one could have predicted. A documentary film about the incident, titled Seat 2A: A Moment of Truth, had won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. Gabrielle's autobiography, Flying While Black: A CEO's Journey from Humiliation to Transformation, had spent 37 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. Most importantly, The changes had become permanent rather than temporary. The oversight committee established by Atlantic Airways had investigated and resolved hundreds of passenger complaints, creating a new standard for accountability in the industry. The bias training programs had evolved from mandatory corporate requirements into ongoing educational initiatives that actually changed hearts and minds. As Gabrielle concluded her Harvard presentation to thunderous applause, she thought about the young people in the audience who would soon enter the corporate world with different expectations about equality and justice. They had grown up seeing that discrimination carried real consequences, that standing up for principles could create lasting change, that individual courage could transform entire systems. The woman who had been humiliated in Seat 2A had become a symbol of resistance and transformation. But more than that, she had proven that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice was not anger or revenge, but the patient, determined work of making sure it never happened again. The transformation was far from complete, but the foundation had been laid for a more equitable future. And it had all started with one person's refusal to be moved from where she belonged. 2 years had passed since the incident that transformed aviation, and the reverberations continued to reshape not just Atlantic Airways, but the entire landscape of corporate America. On a crisp autumn morning, Captain Derek Mitchell sat in his small Denver apartment, watching the news coverage of yet another milestone in Gabrielle Washington's remarkable journey. The television screen showed Gabrielle standing in the rose garden of the White House, her hand resting on a leather-bound Bible as she took the oath to serve on the Presidential Commission on Corporate Accountability. Her appointment represented the culmination of a transformation that had begun in the cramped confines of airplane Seat 2A and now extended to the highest levels of American government. Mitchell's health had deteriorated significantly over the past months. The stress of unemployment, social ostracism, and the constant replay of his professional downfall had taken its toll on his cardiovascular system. His doctor had warned him about the dangers of his elevated blood pressure and irregular heartbeat, but Mitchell found it impossible to manage his anxiety while living in the shadow of his ruined reputation. His wife Linda had left him 6 months earlier, unable to bear the constant scrutiny and social isolation that came with being married to the man who had become synonymous with airline discrimination. Their grown children rarely called anymore, embarrassed by their father's notoriety and tired of defending the indefensible. "She's getting another award," Mitchell mumbled to himself, reaching for the prescription bottles that had become his constant companions. "Presidential Medal of Freedom," they're saying. On the screen, President Johnson spoke eloquently about Gabrielle's contributions to civil rights and corporate reform. When faced with injustice, Gabrielle Washington didn't simply endure it or quietly file a complaint. She used her position of power to ensure that no other American would face the same discrimination. Her courage has transformed an entire industry and created a model for corporate accountability that businesses across our nation are now embracing. The irony wasn't lost on Mitchell that his moment of prejudice had elevated Gabrielle to heights she might never have reached otherwise. His discrimination had given her a platform that amplified her voice and her message far beyond the confines of Atlantic Airways. In trying to diminish her, he had inadvertently made her more powerful than ever. At Atlantic Airways headquarters, the company was celebrating another milestone. The diversity metrics that had seemed impossibly ambitious 2 years earlier had not only been met but exceeded. Minority representation in leadership positions had reached 40%. Customer satisfaction scores continued to break records, and the company had become the gold standard for inclusive business practices. Marcus Williams, now promoted to Chief Operating Officer, stood beside Gabrielle as she addressed the employees gathered in the main auditorium. 2 years ago, this company faced a crisis that could have destroyed us, she said. Instead, we chose to let it rebuild us into something better. The applause was genuine and sustained, coming from a workforce that had been transformed along with the company culture. Employees who had once participated in or tolerated discriminatory behavior had undergone extensive retraining and education. Those who couldn't adapt to the new standards had been replaced by people who embraced the values of equality and respect. But our work isn't finished, Gabrielle continued. Every day we have the opportunity to demonstrate that businesses can be profitable while being principled, that success doesn't require compromising our values, that treating people with dignity isn't just morally right but economically smart. In the audience, A young black woman named Keisha Johnson listened with particular attention. As one of Atlantic Airways' newest pilots, Keisha represented the future that Gabrielle's reforms had made possible. Her path to the cockpit had been supported by the scholarship program, mentorship initiatives, and bias-free hiring practices that now defined the company. After the presentation, Keisha approached Gabrielle with a mixture of nervousness and determination. "Ms. Washington, I wanted to thank you personally. If you hadn't stood up on that flight 2 years ago, I never would have had this opportunity." Gabrielle smiled, remembering her own struggles to break through barriers in the aviation industry. "Keisha, you earned this position through your skill and dedication. I just helped remove some of the obstacles that shouldn't have been there in the first place." "Still," Keisha insisted, "knowing that there are people like you fighting for people like me makes all the difference." The conversation was interrupted by a news alert on the airport television monitors. Derek Mitchell had been found dead in his Denver apartment, apparently from a heart attack. The man who had triggered the transformation of an entire industry had died alone and forgotten, his career destroyed by a moment of prejudice that had seemed so natural to him at the time. Gabrielle felt a complex mix of emotions as she absorbed the news. There was no joy in Mitchell's demise, no sense of victory or vindication. His death represented the ultimate consequence of allowing bias to guide professional decisions, a cautionary tale about the price of discrimination. "He was never able to understand what he had done wrong," she said quietly to Marcus as they watched the news coverage. Even at the end, he saw himself as the victim rather than the perpetrator. The news of Mitchell's death prompted a renewed wave of media attention about the Atlantic Airways incident and its lasting impact. Documentarians interviewed passengers from Flight 447, crew members who had undergone transformation, and industry experts who analyzed the changes that had swept through aviation. Zoe Williams, now 11 years old and more determined than ever to become a pilot, watched the coverage with her mother. "Mom, is it sad that the captain died?" Dr. Angela Williams considered the question carefully. "It's always sad when someone dies, honey, but it's also sad that he never learned from his mistakes, never tried to make things better." "When I become a pilot, I'm going to treat everyone the same," Zoe declared with the absolute certainty of childhood. "I know you will, baby. That's exactly the point of everything Ms. Washington has been working for." The legacy of Seat 2A had become something far greater than anyone could have imagined. Federal legislation now required bias training for all transportation workers. The Atlantic Airways model had been adopted by airlines around the world. Business schools taught case studies about the incident, using it to illustrate the financial and ethical imperatives of inclusive leadership. But perhaps the most important change was in the expectations of a new generation. Young people entering the workforce had grown up seeing that discrimination carried real consequences, that standing up for principles could create lasting change, that individual courage could transform entire systems. As Gabrielle prepared for her move to Washington to begin her work on the Presidential Commission, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The humiliation she had experienced in Seat 2A had been transformed into a platform for creating systemic change. The discrimination that had once diminished her had ultimately amplified her voice and her impact. The airplane seat that had been the site of her degradation had become a symbol of resistance and transformation, displayed in museums as a reminder that progress often begins with one person's refusal to accept injustice. On her final day as CEO of Atlantic Airways, Gabrielle walked through the headquarters she had transformed. In the lobby, a new bronze sculpture had replaced the old airplane monument. This one depicted diverse figures working together, reaching toward the sky with determination and hope. The inscription at the base read, "Justice is not a destination but a journey, not a moment but a movement, not an individual achievement but a collective commitment to treating every person with the dignity they deserve." As she left the building, for the last time as CEO, Gabrielle carried with her the knowledge that her work would continue in new venues, with greater reach and deeper impact. The woman who had been forced from Seat 2A had become an architect of equality, proving that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest act of refusing to be moved from where you belong. The future she had envisioned, where a young black girl could dream of flying planes without worrying about discrimination was no longer just a hope but a reality. And that transformation had started with one moment of standing up, speaking out, and demanding accountability. The journey that began with injustice had become a legacy of justice, proving that individual courage could indeed change the world. This extraordinary story reveals powerful truths about institutional bias and the courage required to create meaningful change. Gabrielle Washington's experience demonstrates that discrimination often thrives in systems where assumptions go unchallenged, and authority figures operate without accountability. Her calm professionalism in the face of humiliation shows that dignity cannot be taken away, only given away. The transformation of Atlantic Airways proves that companies can become more profitable while becoming more ethical. When organizations embrace diversity authentically rather than superficially, they unlock innovation, loyalty, and market opportunities that benefit everyone. The story also illustrates how individual acts of courage can cascade into industry-wide reform. Perhaps, most importantly, this narrative shows that real change requires both personal responsibility and systemic transformation. Captain Mitchell's downfall wasn't just about one moment of prejudice, but about years of unchecked bias that created a culture where discrimination seemed normal. True progress demands that we examine our own assumptions, challenge unfair systems, and create environments where everyone can thrive regardless of their background or appearance. What would you have done in Gabrielle's situation? Have you ever witnessed workplace discrimination that needed to be addressed? Comment below and share your experiences about standing up for what's right. If this story inspired you to become an advocate for equality, smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories of courage overcoming injustice. Share this video with someone who needs to see that individual actions can create massive positive change. Thank you for joining me on this powerful journey from discrimination to transformation. Remember, every person deserves respect and dignity, and sometimes changing the world starts with refusing to accept anything less. Until next time, keep fighting for justice and never underestimate your power to make a difference.